Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something huge, the 1979 Iranian Revolution. I mean, think about it, a 2,500-year-old monarchy
Yeah.
just gone, almost overnight. It's really this classic case, isn't it? How authoritarian regimes fall. First gradually, then suddenly. And at the heart of it all, you have these two incredibly powerful opposing figures, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last emperor, and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the cleric who became this focal point for everyone against the Shah. Their rivalry, that's really the core here.
It is, and what's so crucial to grasp is that this wasn't just politics. It ran much deeper. It was a clash of, personal histories, fundamental beliefs, completely different visions for Iran's future. Understanding their individual journeys, what made them tick, the forces that shaped them, that's absolutely key to understanding this massive shift and why it still matters so much today.
So that's our mission for you today. We're digging into our sources, pulling out the key insights. We'll trace the lives of the Shah and Khomeini, see how they intertwine, explore the forces around them, and figure out how their conflict basically redrew the map for Iran, and honestly for global politics too. Let's dive in.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. The contrast between these two men, right from birth, it's pretty stark. You've got Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, born into royalty, practically handed the throne at just 21, September 1941, right in the thick of World War II. His father, Reza Shah Pahlavi, sources describe him as this very, very powerful, charismatic figure who just dominated his son's life and his father's, let's say, sympathies for the Nazi regime. That didn't fly with the Allies.
Not at all. They needed Iran strategically, for getting war materials to Russia.
Yeah.
So they essentially forced Reza Shah to abdicate, put the young, maybe more pliable son on the throne instead. And the young Shah's upbringing was just meticulously planned out for this role. Special status as crown prince, his friends were handpicked, sent off to a Swiss boarding school for that Western education. Even his marriage to Princess Faiza of Egypt, that was arranged by his father, all designed to cement the Pahlavi dynasty's power.
Right. And while all that's happening, you have Ruhollah Khomeini's story unfolding in a completely different world. Born 1902, Khomeini, an oasis town, youngest of six. And tragedy strikes early. His father's murdered when he's just 5 months old. The circumstances were, well, suspicious, as the sources put it.
Well,
And Khomeini, for his entire life, blamed Reza Shah for it. He believed the Shah intervened to protect the killer.
Wow, so that bitterness started right there.
Deep-seated, it really fueled him. He grew up without a father, raised by his mother and a wealthy aunt. They made sure he got a good education starting school at 5. Apparently a very fast learner, the most gifted student. Spent his time studying, reading the Quran while other kids played. Islamic law was his world, shaped him completely.
And you can see the seeds of conflict being sown even back then with Reza Shah's early reforms.
Exactly. Before he was even pushed out, Reza Shah was pushing to modernize Persia. And one policy in particular really hit a nerve with the clergy, the mullahs,
The veil ban.
the mandatory unveiling of women,
Yeah.
banning the chador. The clergy saw it as a total assault on religious matters.
Mhm.
For Khomeini, steeped in Islamic law, this wasn't just policy, it was a fundamental violation of the principles of Islam. So you can imagine when the Allies forced Reza Shah out, Khomeini must have felt some gratification,
It's a sense of justice, maybe?
perhaps.
Mhm.
He immediately called for Iran to be ruled by Islamic law again. Didn't go anywhere at the time, but it shows where his head was at. Even then, that veil ban, though, that really laid the groundwork for his opposition later on.
So the young Shah takes the throne. How did people see him initially? Sources say he seemed restrained, maybe even a reluctant king. But underneath, he was pretty determined. He wanted to continue his father's modernization drive, but maybe try a softer touch with the clergy and that confrontational style. His focus, though, was definitely westward. November 49, he gets this huge welcome from President Truman in the U.S.
Yeah, Truman wasn't just being friendly, of course. The U.S. had its eye on Iran's huge oil reserves.
And the Shah needed American support, money, technology for his plans. He was fascinated by things like the Hoover Dam, all that technical stuff.
But that pro-West enthusiasm wasn't popular everywhere back home, especially concerning oil. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, mostly British-run, was like a state within a state. They controlled everything.
Right. So when the Iranian parliament, under Prime Minister Mossadegh, nationalized the oil industry in March 1951,
Britain hit back hard. An oil embargo crippled the economy.
and that created chaos, right? Extremist groups gained ground, like the Communist Tudeh Party.
Exactly. The situation got so unstable, the Shah actually fled into exile for a bit.
You had mullahs, communists, all sorts of groups vying for power.
And that's when the CIA stepped in.
Yeah.
Operation Ajax. They backed the Shah, gave him money, helped set up his secret police, SAVAK.
Ah, Savak,
Yeah.
notorious later on.
Very. And this intervention kind of transformed the Shah, made him more assertive, more involved in the day-to-day running of things. One source calls him a kind of Roman Caesar.
Okay, so while all this political drama is playing out, what's Khomeini doing?
Initially, he pulls back, goes to Qum, stays out of the public political fray. He's focusing on his studies, quietly developing his ideas about an Islamic state. But there's this really interesting incident. He actually meets the Shah in person.
Really? When?
During this period, he went to ask for a pardon for an assassin from this radical group, Fadayan Islam.
Fadayan Islam. They were pretty extreme.
Oh, yeah. Demanded a theocracy immediately. Ban all Western influence. They'd assassinated a top intellectual, even a prime minister. And Khomeini, by requesting the pardon, essentially provided the clerical cover, the religious justification, which is often seen as necessary for such actions in Shiite Islam. He kind of legitimized their violence in a way.
It's strange, though. The Shah, despite being so pro-West, was also trying to court the clergy.
He was. He saw them primarily as anti-communist and supportive of the monarchy, traditionally.
So he thought strengthening religion is the best way to fight the communists, who he saw as the main threat.
Exactly. But it was a calculation which won't add up, as one analysis puts it, because the Shia clergy, especially figures like Khomeini, could never be the ideological foundation for Westernization. Their core beliefs were fundamentally opposed to it.
So he saw them as allies against one enemy.
Completely missing that they were becoming an even bigger opponent to his whole project. A massive strategic and ideological miscalculation, really.
Which brings us neatly to 1963 and the White Revolution. January 11th, the Shah launches this big reform package. The stated goal: markedly improve the conditions of life for the people. He even held a referendum. Women couldn't technically vote yet, but apparently they turned out in droves to show support.
It was ambitious stuff. Abolishing the old feudal system, privatizing state companies, literacy campaigns.
And critically, giving women the right to vote and run for office. That was seen as a huge milestone.
Absolutely. Plus, major land reform, giving over 500,000 hectares to tens of thousands of poor families.
Even using soldiers to teach in villages, trying to uplift the rural population.
But this faced determined resistance from the clergy.
And for Khomeini and his camp.
This new role for women in particular was seen as a direct threat to the foundation of their faith. This is when Khomeini really steps out of the shadows. He stops being withdrawn and becomes the public mouthpiece for a group of mullahs rejecting everything the Shah stood for, especially the pro-Western policies.
He confronts the Shah directly.
Openly. Warns him not to carry on with his father's ways. We have letters, speeches from the time showing this direct antagonism. Khomeini starts denouncing corruption, state violence, the torture by Savak, and he threatens a black reaction to the White Revolution.
Black reaction. Ominous.
It led to clashes, demonstrations, counter-demonstrations in '63, bloodshed in Qum when the Shah sent in the army.
And Khomeini.
Arrested, sentenced to death initially.
Wow.
Other clerics pleaded for him, and the sentence was changed to exile. First Turkey, then Najaf in Iraq.
So the White Revolution, good intentions maybe, but tough execution.
Definitely. Implementation was hard, especially for rural people who often lack resources to make the reforms work. And crucially, the Shah had systematically dismantled any secular political opposition. As one source notes, he made it impossible for anyone other than the clergy to have a political organization,
Leaving a vacuum.
that the religious establishment was perfectly positioned to fill.
Okay, so fast forward a bit. We see the Shah entering this era of, well, imperial grandeur, while Khomeini is in exile. October 1967, the coronation, he crowns himself Shahanshah, King of Kings, and in a first for Persia, he crowns his wife Faradiba as Empress.
And interestingly, the clergy actually supported this coronation. The Shah was smart enough to understand he needed to invoke that religious legitimacy for the ordinary people.
Then there's the state visit to West Germany in '67. Good for business, but
But it blew up. Savak agents literally attacked Iranian protesters in Germany who were demonstrating against repression back home
in Germany.
in Germany. It revealed the ugly face of the Shah regime to the West and became a huge scandal, a real turning point in the history of West Germany.
And the spending, the monuments, the celebrations, that 1971 Persepolis party.
Oh, the 2,500-year anniversary of the Persian Empire. The biggest party in the world, they called it. Held out in the desert, monarchs, heads of state flown in,
Yeah.
but the Iranian people themselves, largely excluded.
That sounds tone deaf.
Extremely. One source says, while the idea might have had some merit, the Execution went so much in an exaggerated way mixed with cronyism and corruption that I think it backfired. Showed how out of touch he was becoming.
But he was still investing heavily in modernization, right?
Yeah.
Electrification, industry.
Billions. He genuinely aimed for Iran to be among the 5 most prosperous countries of the world.
Believing that modernization is, to a large extent, westernization.
Tehran certainly transformed, became a modern city very open to Western culture. You hardly saw veiled women there.
But politically?
Still completely autocratic, everything tailored to the Shah. He lost contact with the people, especially traditional groups like the bazaars, the merchants, who felt threatened by big Western-style stores.
Yet, paradoxically, even in the 70s, he was still funding mosque renovations, Quran schools.
Yeah, still trying to keep the clergy on side. He saw religion as his last line of defense, probably against the left, against communism.
Which turned out to be
a massive strategic and ideological miscalculation. Because, as another source bluntly puts it, what he thought was his most powerful stronghold turned out to be his most fatal and dangerous enemy.
Meanwhile, Khomeini in Najaf, how was exile treating him?
Initially, pretty tough. He was in his 60s, felt finished, isolated. Many local clerics in Iraq were wary of his politics. He spent most of his time studying scripture, only talking to a few close pupils, relying on family. A very distant figure, rarely even left his house.
But he wasn't idle.
Not at all. Discreetly but with confidence, he kept developing his ideas for an Islamic state, with clergy in charge. He railed against Western shallowness and pure sensual pleasures, attacked colonialism, Israel, demanded religion and politics be reunited.
And his lectures became a book?
Yep. Transcripts were collected and published as Islamic Government or Islamic State, banned in Iran, of course.
Which only made people more curious.
Exactly. Censorship just increased the fascination among the growing number of people opposed to the Shah.
And the Shah's response to any dissent was
harsh. Dissent, or worse, resistance, had no place. Parties were silenced, opponents jailed or forced into exile. Savak prisons were notorious. Torture, executions. This built up huge resentment. Though it's worth noting, some sources say the opposition exaggerated the number of people who were in prison. Maybe around 4,000 political prisoners, not the hundreds of thousands sometimes claimed. Still significant, though.
Okay, so you have all this pressure building for years, and then 1978, it just explodes. A fast-moving revolution.
It really picked up speed incredibly quickly. The spark, January 78 in Qom.
Yeah.
A major newspaper published this really insulting article attacking Khomeini, calling him and the clergy counter-revolutionaries.
Likely planted by the regime.
Almost certainly. His followers organized a protest, security forces opened fire, people were killed.
And that kicked off the cycle.
The 40-day mourning cycle. According to Islamic tradition, you commemorate the dead after 40 days. So 40 days after the Qom killings, more protests, more killings. Then 40 days later, even bigger protests. Hundreds of thousands hitting the streets. The numbers just kept growing.
The Shah must have been reeling.
He wasn't anticipating this kind of resistance, caught completely off guard. Sources say he seemed paralyzed by the sheer growing power of the streets.
Then came the Cinema Rex fire, August 1978.
Horrific. An arson attack in Abadan. 422 people burned alive inside the cinema. The opposition immediately blamed Savak, blamed the Shah.
But was it them?
Later evidence strongly suggested it was actually Islamist revolutionaries, maybe even with Khomeini's tacit approval, wanting to frame the regime and incite more anger.
Regardless of who did it, the effect was
devastating. It ignited fury. For the first time, you had thousands chanting, "Death to the Shah." That was a major turning point.
Tehran was burning. The military steps in. Black Friday.
September 8th, 1978. Troops fired on demonstrators in Jela Square in Tehran. Officially 64 killed, but the opposition claimed thousands, maybe 15,000. Massively inflated, but the symbolic impact was huge.
And then a general strike.
Brought the whole country to a standstill. Oil workers, civil servants, everyone paralyzed.
And Khomeini, where was he in all this? Still in Najaf.
Until October 78. The Shah, desperate, pressured Iraq to expel him, declared him persona non grata. Khomeini apparently didn't want to go to a non-Islamic country, but his advisors persuaded him Europe was the best bet.
And he ends up in France.
Neauphle-le-Château, a little village outside Paris. And suddenly, he's an international media sensation.
Really? From quiet exile to...
Suddenly catapulted into an international celebrity. Followers flew in from everywhere. Western journalists queued up. Even figures like Sartre and Foucault visited him, showed support. Quite the transformation. And this is where you really see Khomeini's shrewdness. He was much more clever than the Shah. much more than people realize. In all those interviews in Paris, he was very careful. He never mentioned the really radical ideas he expressed in his book on the Islamic State.
Because the book was banned in Iran, unknown in the West.
Exactly. That no one could really challenge him on it. So he presented this image of, wanting democracy, human rights, just opposing the Shah's tyranny. Meanwhile, his fiery speeches against the Shah were being secretly recorded on cassette tape,
Ah, the famous tapes.
smuggled into Iran and distributed everywhere. So we had this carefully managed public face for the West and this revolutionary message firing up people back home. Masterful manipulation of media, really.
So the final weeks, the situation is just falling apart for the Shah.
Utterly. The generals are waiting for the order to crack down hard, put down the revolution by force.
But the Shah...
He's weakened, sick with cancer, though maybe few knew the extent. He hesitates. He gives no clear signal. The military becomes perplexed and backs off. They don't know what to do without a decisive order.
And that leads to those incredible scenes. People putting flowers in soldiers' guns.
Giving them pictures of Khomeini, the army's morale just collapses.
And then the Shah makes that TV appeal.
Oh, that was painful to watch, according to accounts. He looked weak, absolutely despondent, struggling to read the text, saying things like, "I have heard the call of your revolution. Give me another chance."
Too little, too late.
Way too late. Everyone saw it as a sign of his weakness, confirmation he couldn't handle it.
And the international powers, they saw the writing on the wall.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The crisis hit the global stage. French President Giscard d'Estaing calls a summit in Guadeloupe, January 79. He invites Schmidt from West Germany, Carter from the U.S., Callahan from the U.K.
And they
decide on the fate of Iran.
The takeaway was clear. The Western powers dropped the Shah and his regime. They weren't going to prop him up anymore.
So just days later, January 16th, 1979.
The Shah and Empress Farah leave Iran. They apparently thought they might return.
But it was a farewell for good.
Reflecting on him, one source described him as maybe a good king for the time of peace, but just not equipped for big trouble. This sort of double personality, confident when things were going well, but crumbling at the first sign of real weakness.
And with the Shah gone, Khomeini becomes the undisputed leader.
He became the point of union. It was remarkable, really. All these different groups, leftists, nationalists, intellectuals, even big business, they all support him in that moment. An impressive display of unity against the old regime. So just 2 weeks after the Shah leaves,
February 1st, 1979, Khomeini flies back from Paris to Tehran.
the reception must have been incredible.
Millions absolutely frenetically celebrated his return, hailed him as the new savior. It was the definitive end of the monarchy, all 2,500 years of it.
His first stops were symbolic.
Very. He went straight to the Behesht Zara cemetery, the burial place for many killed by the Shah's regime. Then to Khomeini, the holy city where his resistance really began. It really boils down to two opposing wills, doesn't it? And Khomeini's will, far stronger to conquer power than the Shah's will to keep power. In the aftermath, well, it unfolded quickly. The Shah wandered from country to country seeking medical treatment, eventually dying from his cancer in Cairo, July 1980. He was 60. Buried in the Al-Rifai Mosque there, Ayatollah Khomeini ruled for 10 years, dying of a heart attack in June 1989. And in those 10 years, he absolutely implemented his ideas of an Islamic revolution with uncompromising vigor. He reshaped Iran into the theocracy he envisioned, setting forces in motion, a dynamic which even today keeps the world in suspense.
Indeed it does. So, wrapping up this deep dive, the lessons are pretty profound, aren't they? You look at the Shah's goals, modernization, improving lives, and some things did improve. But his methods, his autocratic rule, his misreading of the religious forces, it all alienated so many people and, kind of ironically, paved the way for his biggest enemy. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Given the Shah wanted progress, tried to balance West and tradition, could there have been a different path for Iran? One that achieved modernization without this radical revolutionary upheaval? Or was this clash just bound to happen? Given the history, the grievances, the power of Khomeini's counter-ideology, what does this whole story suggest to you about power, about faith, and how societies change, sometimes gradually and sometimes all at once? Lots to think about there.